Hi everybody and welcome to Matrix Live Season 7, Episode 17. I'm afraid that Thibaut's out this week and Ben is busy compiling TWIM in the corner, so you're stuck with me, Matthew, with an overview of what I've been thinking about this week for Matrix. Probably top of mind is the Digital Markets Act, and apologies if you're bored of hearing me and Amandine enthuse about it, but it's been at least a couple of weeks, possibly a couple of months since we mentioned it last on Matrix Live. And the Digital Markets Act is European Union legislation to try to guarantee a fairer marketplace for communication by forcing the big gatekeepers, Facebook, Google, Apple, Microsoft, etc., to open up their communication silos and, in fact, their business as a whole to avoid using their sort of borderline monopolistic position as the reason to encourage new users to use the service. Basically, the thesis is that people use something like WhatsApp originally because it was a great app. But then when the app gets big enough, the reason to use WhatsApp isn't necessarily because it's the best one, but because that's where everybody is. And so the service starts to get complacent. It no longer differentiates necessarily on features, like we don't even have edit or emoji reactions or whatever on WhatsApp. And instead, they just rely on the sheer size of the communication system to be the reason why people would be using it in the first place. This isn't very good for users. And it's not really good for the marketplace either, because other people can't necessarily come in. Like, I know some random Matrix server is going to be at a massive disadvantage because it doesn't have the network effects of the 200 whatever billion users who are on WhatsApp. So the EU is coming along and saying, hey guys, sorry, but you need to provide open APIs so that people can bridge into the existing platforms without limitation, so that people can actually interoperate with the likes of WhatsApp, etc. Now, the big thing that has changed since we last spoke about it is that the European Union legislative process, where the Parliament and Council and Commission get together and try to reach agreement on the shape of a new legislative act, actually happened. This was, Thursday, 2 weeks ago now, and agreed that interoperability for communications should indeed be mandated for the gatekeepers, i.e. companies bigger than $75 billion of market cap or doing more than $7.5 billion of revenue a year. And that, APIs must happen. They must preserve end-to-end encryption, which is incredibly reassuring, because there's a real dystopia where the EU might turn around and say, well, actually, yes, everyone has APIs, but don't worry about encryption, at which point it could seriously undermine encryption. But instead, they mandated it for the APIs. And most importantly, you've got to be able to use these APIs for interoperability. So from a Matrix perspective, and a global perspective, this is an absolute step change. The law has been agreed. It will basically go into practice unless whatever happens from this point in, as far as we can tell. And one way of thinking of it is that it basically makes bridging not just legal, but obligatory. That anybody big enough, and this doesn't include Signal or Telegram or even Discord, but all of the massive trillion-dollar style players out there would have no choice but to go and provide open APIs and maintain them with good specification forevermore. So you're not going to have a situation like the one where Twitter had open APIs one day and then shut them down the next day and killed off the entire alternative Twitter market overnight. Instead, it's providing them for everybody to continue using. Ironically, Twitter isn't quite big enough yet to be covered by the legislation, but give them a few years, they probably will be. So, this has been a bit controversial in some quarters because it means that if you have different end-to-end encrypted chat systems, like WhatsApp going and talking to Matrix, then the bridge that would connect the two together will necessarily have to re-encrypt the messages to convert it from WhatsApp's flavor of the double ratchet through to Matrix's flavor of the double ratchet. And even if we were speaking the same cryptographic protocol, we would still need to convert the payloads within that protocol from one to the other, so we'd need to re-encrypt in a bridge. So this obviously breaks end-to-end encryption, which means that an attacker or bad party who's running the bridge will be able to see the plain text messages, which is a major step down from if you were talking natively from somebody, say, on Matrix to somebody else on Matrix, or somebody on WhatsApp to somebody on WhatsApp. So there's been lots of concern, particularly from the sort of, frankly, ex-Facebook employees, people like Alex Stamos, who was CISO at Facebook, Alec Muffet, who implemented the end-to-end encryption in Facebook Messenger, concerned that this is the beginning of a slippery slope to undermine all end-to-end encryption in WhatsApp and Facebook and iMessage and everywhere else. I think this is completely flawed, for what it's worth. For instance, Facebook already compromises their end-to-end encryption on their business API. In fact, they have a paid API where they sell access to their user base, and obviously, well, not obviously, but they don't even try to expose end-to-end encryption on it. If you go and terminate the traffic on a web service that is processing it, it goes and decrypts it server side, and they don't even warn you as the user in the user interface when they're doing this. So I think the concerns there about it being a slippery slope to undermine all end-to-end encryption is just a smokescreen and incredibly hypocritical, given that they're already doing it for their own business API. They're just trying to stop people from, well, I guess they're trying to protect their business API, and instead, and they're doing so by mandating that, or trying to avoid being mandated to do a free, open, well-specified API that everybody can use. So it sort of makes sense that there is a lot of pushback there. We've been trying to put out blog posts and facts to try to contradict it and reassure people that it's basically a trade-off. That sure, you're not going to have end-to-end encryption when going between WhatsApp and Matrix, but relative to not being able to talk to somebody on Matrix at all, or being completely locked into WhatsApp in terms of the features that they provide. Say if I wanted to add a machine translation bot into a WhatsApp conversation right now, no way to do it at all. And in fact, if somebody didn't want to translate my messages, they'll probably do it by copy-pasting it into Google Translate, which is going to be undermining the encryption and security anyway by exfiltrating it to a different service. Whereas if you instead let I don't know, Matrix services or any other service build on top of the Facebook, WhatsApp APIs, then you could have all sorts of features like machine translation, or plugging it into a CRM, going and putting it into a ticketing system, adding in a virtual assistant, whatever it might happen to be, you'll be able to do in an official way, and the app could warn you on WhatsApp to say, hello, you are now leaving WhatsApp. You are being re-encrypted. You're not as secure as if you were talking to a native user on WhatsApp. And likewise on Matrix, we can finally put the UI into place to warn people when they're being bridged, so that if you are in a conversation that's end-to-end encrypted, and yet there is a end-to-bridge encryption going on, which is re-encrypting it for WhatsApp or whatever, it could say, by the way, no, it's not quite as encrypted as it should be. You are now leaving Matrix. All bets are off. But at least as a user, you would have the freedom to make that decision on whether to sacrifice a bit of encryption in favor of flexibility to build in bots, or other services, or talk to people on other platforms. Say if you're on a platform where WhatsApp doesn't exist, but you still want to talk to people on WhatsApp, obviously you're going to have to bridge and re-encrypt. And of course, if you are using an alternative client which speaks the same protocol, whether it's Matrix or the WhatsApp protocol, you can still maintain end-to-end encryption. So that's one set of concerns and how we've tried to address them. Another set of concerns has been all around identity. And there was real yelling from Alex Stamos particularly about the fact that Matrix currently doesn't have a decentralized identity system. If you want to find out what Matrix ID a given phone number has, you talk to our identity servers, which we run on vector.im and matrix.org, which are logically centralized. And as a result, it's not a great solution. Everything else in Matrix is decentralized, apart from the mapping service that you would use to discover Matrix IDs. And the reason for this is that back in 2014 or so, when we came up with Matrix and the identity system, we assumed that within the next few months or possibly years, somebody would solve the problem of decentralized identity and we would switch over to using it. What's happened instead is that, frankly, the lack of legislation like the DMA has meant that there isn't much incentive for other people to solve decentralized identity. None of the big players want to do it because they love trapping their users inside their centralized identity models. None of the existing industries particularly want to do it either. Like the telcos could do it because everybody's phone has already got a SIM card in it with a global hardware token, public key infrastructure, except, commercially speaking, the telcos want to trap people inside their cabal of PSTN. And as a result, nobody's solved it. There's been some work in the blockchain community around DIDs, and there's been some work around verifiable credentials, and COVID has also accelerated some work on sort of verifiable claims in this space. So right now I can prove to somebody in a fairly decentralized way that I'm vaccinated against COVID, but I don't have a way to prove in a decentralized way that my phone number maps onto this Matrix ID or this any other decentralized identifier. So the DMA could potentially change this fundamentally by suddenly making it actually interesting and viable and have a good reason to have decentralized identity. So over the last week or two, I've been working and thinking an awful lot about how we actually fix the mess of identity lookups in Matrix and kill off our old placeholder centralized identity lookup model. And I think we've got some approaches that could work quite well. And a lot of the inspiration here comes from Keybase, who people might recall started off life as a way of mapping various different real-world identities through to, at first, a PGP key, and then later on a Curve 25519 private key. And the idea is that somehow you've got a key which is which you as a human carrying around with you. And it could be within an app, it could be within a keychain, a TPM on your device. It could be in a SIM card, it could be a hardware token like a YubiKey, it could be some biometric thing built into your DNA, I don't know. But basically, you got your private key. You need to prove to people that it maps through to you. And so you would go and publish proofs on Twitter and Facebook and Mastodon and Matrix and everywhere else, so to say, hey, if you want to, I'm proving that the person who controls this account also owns that private key. So for the DMA, we have the problem of, I've got somebody's phone number, or perhaps their email address or some other identifier. How do I contact them? Are they on WhatsApp? Are they on iMessage? Are they on Matrix? Are they on XMPP? And at the moment, there just isn't any protocol or service that you could use for that. But imagine if there was a decentralized Keybase style solution where I could take my private key that I use for my end-to-end encryption, and I could go and sign a proof that says, look, I actually own this phone number because I take one of the two-factor auth verifications that you do when you sign up on WhatsApp or Matrix or Viber or whatever it might be. And you sign the result of that 2FA to say, hey, I proved using this provider that I own that phone number. And with a DMA, they could be obligated to just publish that attestation like you would on Keybase with Twitter or wherever. So I might go to whatsapp.com/attestations/ my phone number, and anybody can go and check that to see that me holding the private key that proves that I'm Matthew has gone and proved that I own that phone number. Then separately, you can have a decentralized data structure very similar to a matrix room, possibly the same as a matrix room, some kind of replicated Merkle DAG, which would contain the same set of attestations. So if I want to figure out whose phone number I have, which service my phone number is on, I would go to whatever local copy of that index, basically, plug in my phone number, get out an attestation. I could then check that attestation on wherever its kind of origin is, so whatsapp.com/attestations or whatever. And that therefore proves that I want to be found using that third-party ID on WhatsApp. I think, it's a bit simplistic and haven't completely finished fleshing out what the protocol looks like. It could be a really simple, pragmatic way of solving this. Except in the past, everybody would have said, oh my God, WhatsApp will never go and do that because they're basically opening up their identity system to interoperate with everybody. But if the DMA comes around and says, look, the only way in which you can find each other is via a decentralized identity system like this, in some ways, it's even more exciting than the idea of mandating interoperable protocols for communication. Instead, or open APIs, it's basically mandating the interoperable identity for those protocols to work, or those APIs to work. And that could be completely transformational. So basically lots of work going on with that. I've been chatting a lot to some of the other Keybase style companies and projects out there to figure out how they've done it, and hopefully we'll be able to publish something real soon now. It's also been really annoying to see the ex-Facebook people saying the DMA is flawed because it predicates that this identity system exists when it doesn't exist, when it can't exist due to Zucku's triangle. Whereas in practice, it does exist already with SIM cards and all sorts of things. And the only reason that, I can't use the enum DNS system to look up already what phone number or what phone network or what services my phone number is associated with is, again, a purely commercial thing. Like, the phone networks use enum as a DNS technology internally already to track what network your phone number is on so that they can route to it over the PSTN. However, they don't make that public on the internet unless you pay Cineverse or Newstar extraordinary amounts of money to be able to query the enum database, purely from a commercial consideration, because they want to keep it private, closed, as a cabal where people can, where they can sell access to it for lots of money and make it basically a closed old boys club of telcos. Whereas the hope with enum was that it would be public. And there's no reason it can't just sit on the public DNS alongside the normal internet root servers. In fact, it could use the normal internet root zone servers in order to track what phone number does what. But it didn't because of commercial reasons. So again, the DMA gives another way potentially to provide public enum as a completely alternative solution to this. So basically, when people say this is impossible and it can never happen, the only reason it's impossible is because of the legislation not existing, and now it does. It opens up a whole new world for this. And at Matrix, we're basically seeing it as our responsibility to try to build out examples and demonstrations and actually start using it ourselves and prove to the world that interoperability can work when there is a mandate to do so for the big guys, and watch this space. We're also going to try to sync with the various project leads for the various gatekeepers and have this conversation perhaps a little more, how can I put it, diplomatically, and see whether we can reassure them as Matrix that the DMA is good news rather than the sky's falling and it's the end of everything for them. All it will do is to encourage them to differentiate by shipping better products and adding better features, which will be better for everybody, rather than just relying complacently on the size of their network to hold their users hostage. So that was my brief, 3-minute overview of the DMA, which has, of course, turned into 18 minutes. But hopefully it was interesting. Other stuff we have going on is, are we peer-to-peer yet? So somebody on Hacker News about 6 months ago complained bitterly that they have no visibility on our peer-to-peer matrix progress, and facetiously suggested we should have an arewep2pyet.org. I promptly registered it, promised that I'd put it live. 6 months went by, I haven't had a chance. But Keegan, who works on peer-to-peer and Android, kindly put it together this week. And so if you go to arewep2pyet.com, you will find a wonderful overview of all the work that needs to be done left on peer-to-peer. And honestly, it's getting quite close. We're making huge progress on adversarial, not adversarial bridging, fixing adversarial network conditions for peer-to-peer, all the work that Devin is doing using the Pinecone simulator. And we think we've got a solution in the wings now for every class of attack that we know about. So once that's done, we'll publish our threat model and our mitigations to it, and be interesting to see what the world makes of our findings there. Also, new things in peer-to-peer are switching transport again, going from U2P to Quick, which is actually working pretty well. Now we've fixed some bugs in how Pinecone's queuing works. We've got a Pinecone client for Mac OS, which hasn't been released yet, but I'm running it right now. It's currently connected to two nodes. One is a static one at pinecone.matrix.org, and the other is Bluetooth Low Energy on my phone here. And meanwhile, on pinecone.matrix.org, we've actually turned the static cluster there, static node there, into a cluster hosted on Kubernetes, which is kind of fun to see an entire hive, a swarm of peer-to-peer nodes sitting there server-side in order to kind of provide the bootstrap, actually not really bootstrap, but provide a sort of always-on cloud of nodes for the benefit of the network. What else can I say on peer-to-peer? Dendrite itself is coming along really well as the server to use in peer-to-peer. Till, who joined us a few months ago, is making great progress cracking through getting parity with Synapse. And meanwhile, Neil and Keegan are focusing on sort of the more exotic stuff. And as I mentioned, Devon is doing all the adversarial stuff. And then another big project, which is unbelievably exciting, is ElementX on iOS. So this is an entirely new iOS client, which will gloriously replace the poor old Element iOS app that is now 7 odd years old and really showing its age. ElementX is built on the Rust SDK, and it uses native Swift UI. And it's very early days right now, but you can go and find it on GitHub. And if you try, and it's actually dead easy to install if you've got Xcode available on a Mac. And it runs on Mac OS and iOS. So it finally gives us a really nice native Mac OS client. And some of the work that Stefan, who's leading it, has done over the last week is really exciting. So we've got blur hashes, which we never had on Element iOS, and immediately make the experience of loading images much better. We just turned on end-to-end encryption by flipping the right bit, and so the Rust SDK sprang into action, giving us crypto. And we've got encrypted images as of about 12 hours ago. Rich text as well, working and looking better than it ever did in Element iOS. It is missing a few minor features, like the ability to send messages is probably the biggest one that we're lacking right now. But really, really exciting to see the work that Stefan is up to there. Can't wait for it to land. Another big one is live location sharing. So this is the whole find my iPhone style use case, or meet up with a user, share my location for the next hour so I can find out where they are. We already have static location share, so live location sharing extends this in two flavors. One is historical location, live location. So this is useful if you are doing something like tracking the whereabouts of a parcel that's being delivered to you, and you want to see over time where it's been on a map. And what for that we do is to basically just do a series of static location shares, albeit as a thread, or technically as m.references aggregations, so that the client can draw a breadcrumb trail of where this object has been. And that's what we're doing first, because it's easiest. We're not going to ship it, though, in Element, at least by default. It's more there as a way to get all of the GPS tracking and background support, etc. done. Separately, we've got MSC 3489, which is actually, is that the right one? No, it isn't. It's MSC 3672 from memory, although I might have misremembered that. Let me just quickly find the right one. I'm not going to be able to find it on the fly, am I? One sec. And the answer is, it is... Oh, it is MSC 3672. So this is ephemeral live location sharing. This is what you would actually want to do in reality. So this goes and basically sends EDUs, ephemeral data units, to describe where you are for as long as you want to keep sending them. So they never hit the DAG, the persistent data structure of the room. Instead, they're thrown around like typing notifications or read receipts. And This is where what we'll do by default in Element, just from a privacy perspective, but it requires quite a lot of work because it needs custom EDUs to be implemented, and then it also needs state keys to be fixed so that multiple state keys can be set by a given user in a room. So today, if I lock a state event to just being set by me, I'm only allowed to set one state event of a given type. Whereas if, for instance, I wanted to advertise to the world or myself where my iPhone was and where my MacBook Pro is, then I'm going to have the same matrix ID that I used to set both events, but I need to publish these two different beacons, as we call them. So we need to fix the access control slightly to support that. So basically, ephemeral privacy-preserving location share complete with end-to-end encrypted EDUs will be coming later, but the first cut will be using the ones which you store in the timeline of a room. So watch the space on that. God, it's been a long week. Then, another big set of work this week has been Sync v3. So we're almost at the point of deploying a live proxy for people to play with against matrix.org. So anybody with a Sync v3 or sliding sync capable client will be able to connect to at least matrix.org using it. And if they want to use their own home server, they're welcome to run their own proxy for it. And this is all very experimental still and still evolving pretty rapidly. But Keegan has gone and implemented a Sync v3 branch on Element Web that works against a proxy. It takes about 3 seconds from memory to launch basically any account from cold, which is better than the 15 minutes that my account takes otherwise right now to launch from cold. It's been great using Element Web as a test jig to experiment with and debug the whole protocol of sliding sync. And there are still some bits which we need to get right, particularly around end-to-end encrypted notifications or lack thereof. Spaces, I think, need some work too. But by dogfooding it against real Element Web, it's very exciting to see it being something that we will be able to use in practice, at least as alpha or beta quality, very shortly. And finally, third room, our spatial web or immersive web or metaverse on Matrix project has been getting better and better and better. So sneak preview there is the original demo that Robert did a few months ago has now been completely restructured and re-implemented in a proper non-hacky sustainable way. Part of this has been to shift the entire 3D engine to be genuinely multi-threaded, which is really exciting because if you're on a computer with multiple cores, like basically all machines have these days, you can keep the main thread for boring web app JavaScript stuff, and then all the physics and all the rendering and all that stuff happens in completely separate threads. So I think it's the first triple buffered, lock-free, threaded, web-based game engine the world has ever seen. So really proud of the work that Robert and Nate have been doing putting this together. And AJ, who many might know is working on Cine, the excellent React-based Matrix client, has also been helping us building out the web UI third room, which has got entirely new designs thanks to Ryan. And these should be landing very shortly, but really makes for a really, really sexy Matrix web client optimized for rich, immersive, full-screen 3D content. And it's built on top of the Hydrogen web SDK, so all the chat components, etc., you get for free from Hydrogen, and the super lightweight architecture you get from Hydrogen. But then the overall app is actually written in React, so you get the simplicity of the whole React ecosystem for things like adding in more components, etc. So basically, super efficient, lightweight 3D engine, super lightweight, efficient Matrix SDK and chat rooms, and then glued together in a very extensible React architecture. And I was playing with it the other day, and if you're feeling particularly enterprising, you can always go and check it out and run it yourself from github.com/matrix-org/third room, and you'll find yourself teleported quite literally into a world with 2,000 Lambert-shaded boxes which fall out of the sky and form basically a playpen of boxes or cubes or cuboids technically sitting on an infinite plane which you can run over it and jump around in and fly over and kick around and push around, and it sits there churning away at 60 frames a second using the Rapier physics engine to go and simulate this brave new world. So next up is actually communicating over Matrix using it, which will use the MSC 3401 VoIP signaling work that we've been doing for Element Cool, as well as hooking up VoIP itself so you can talk to people in this world, and finishing off the web UI and also putting some content into it. And I've been building some games which I think can be rather fun for people to play with as multiplayer 3D stuff to do, because we don't want to build another Mozilla Hubs, we don't want to build another alt space where people hang around and it's basically a voice conference with weird avatars looking at one another. Instead, we want to be able to do fun stuff in this, and some of the crappy little multiplayer sort of 8-bit style games which I've been playing with, and I think might be quite exciting when we finally get around to revealing them. So that's what's been happening in Third Room. And honestly, that's just the tip of the iceberg. There are so many people working on Matrix, both within Element and within the wider community these days. A Matrix Live, which actually tried to span everything that happened in a given week, would be impossible. But that's at least the stuff that I can remember off the top of my head that I've been thinking about this week. Sorry for monologuing for half an hour, but hopefully that was of interest to somebody. Thanks for listening. Have an amazing weekend, and thank you for flying Matrix. Bye.